slaves are fleeing very early, at least in small numbers, toward Union armies and Union installations, and basically saying, take us, let us work for you, because our masters are putting us to work on their fortifications used against you. Take us and let us help you. And even someone like Benjamin Butler, who is the commanding officer at Ft.Monroe on the Virginia Peninsula, and who is at the far conservative end of the political spectrum in the United States in 1860. He's a Massachusetts politician who wants the Democratic Party to nominate Jefferson Davis for president in 1860. But now, as a commander of a Union garrison, when slaves come and offer themselves on his behalf, he's at least smart enough to figure out what an advantage this is militarily, and he takes them in. And when the slave-owning officer comes and demands the return of those slaves, Butler says no. And he puts these slaves under his protection. And shortly, when other slaves in the vicinity realize what's happened, they follow the example of the first few slaves, and eventually Butler's got thousands.
Up until, I think, the 1960s, historians kept telling us that the slaves had nothing to do with their own emancipation. And I think one of the ironies is that, unless I'm mistaken, which I may be, the very historian for whom your professorship is named,
you're absolutely right.
yeah, was one of those people.
That's right, Randall.
Yeah,
James
Randall.
G. Randall.
Yeah.
No question about it. From about the 1890s through the 1960s, the vast majority of American historians who dealt with this subject said just what you've summarized, that this was a war. If it was a war over slavery, it was a war in which the slaves themselves seemed to evince no interest, and they instead remained loyal supporters of their masters. There were even African American historians who went along with this argument, because this is everything that everyone else was saying, and they just took it as good coin. Everything that in fact occurred in the Civil War that disproved all of this was as though forgotten by the 1890s. Right. And it reflected a conservatization of the North that we were talking about earlier, that this was conveniently put aside, and this myth of black passivity became truth. Everybody knew this. Now, W.E.B. Du Bois in the 1930s published a book based on easily available evidence that attempted to remind the public that this was not true, that slaves had played a crucial role not only in resisting slavery but in assisting the Union war effort. It was a book called Black Reconstruction in America, almost entirely ignored by the history profession in the 1930s. It wasn't until after the Civil War.
Did Du Bois write that?
Yes. It wasn't W.B. Du Bois. It wasn't until after the civil rights movement began to gather steam in the North that a number of historians began to open up to another point of view. One of the earliest is Kenneth Stamp in the 1950s. I mean, not only was it assumed that blacks were passive in the Civil War, it was also largely assumed that slavery was a benevolent institution, and that masters were all kindly and considerate. In other words, the North had bought most of the South's self-justification at the time of the Civil War. Right. And you'll find all sorts of books written, including those written by people who eventually become quite famous. If the book was published before about 1960, it will likely echo all these sentiments.
Isn't the greatest example in American history of that the book and the movie Gone with the Wind?
Well, it's a good one. Yeah. It's a good example. Yeah. And that still influences people's perceptions because a lot of people still see that movie.
And if you look, I can't remember it, but at the beginning there's this very poetic thing about there was a society, you know, of beautiful women and flowers and gallant men, and today it's all gone with the wind.
There is, as you may know, a very popular singer today who calls herself Lady Antebellum. And that is in tribute to this glorious but now lost civilization before the war. Yeah. And it symbolizes that, her naming herself that and nobody screaming about that symbolizes how slow academic learning is to penetrate into the society at large.
This excerpt is brought to you by the Massachusetts School of Law, the leader of reform in legal education and a leader in multimedia education for the public. To view the full interview and for a full listing of MSL's programs, log on to mslaw.edu.